I was about to sit at the dinner table. My father stopped me and pushed the chair away. Without looking at me, he said, "I don't sit with a poor, useless kid." Some people laughed, others looked away. My sister pulled out her phone and started recording. I stood up, calm. Then I said, "You just made a very expensive mistake." The dining room at my grandmother's house holds 24 people comfortably, and that night there were closer to 30 because it was her 80th birthday, and everyone who'd ever wanted a favor from my father had found a reason to show up. Long tables had been pushed together down the center of the room, and every place setting had a small card with a name written in careful cursive. Mine sat at the corner near the kitchen door, which I understood without anyone telling me was not an accident. My father had never once, in the 12 years since I'd moved out, let me sit anywhere near the head of a table. I pulled the chair out anyway. I'd learned a long time ago that flinching before he even did anything only made it worse. So I kept my face neutral and started to sit down, and that was when his hand closed around the back of the chair and pulled it a full foot away from the table. He didn't look at me when he did it. He was looking at his wine glass, swirling it slightly, checking the color against the chandelier light, and he said, in the same tone he might use to comment on the weather, "I don't sit with a poor, useless kid." The room didn't go silent immediately. There was a beat where people kept talking, kept passing the bread, and then the silence spread outward like a stain. My cousin laughed first, a short, uncomfortable bark he tried to swallow halfway through. My aunt looked down at her plate. My uncle studied the ceiling. My sister was sitting 2 seats down, and I watched her pull her phone out of her purse, thumb already moving to open the camera. She had that expression she gets, the one where her mouth curves up just slightly at the corners, the expression of someone who has just been handed content. I didn't sit back down in the pulled-away chair because there was nothing to sit in. I stood there for a second, feeling the eyes of 30 people on me, feeling the particular kind of heat that comes from being humiliated in front of a room full of relatives who will remember this exact moment for years. I didn't raise my voice. I just straightened my back, looked at him directly for the first time since I'd walked into the room, and said it the way you'd point out a parking violation to someone about to get towed. "You just made a very expensive mistake." He laughed, a short exhale through his nose, the kind that says he found the comment beneath a real response. He picked his wine glass back up and told the table that I'd always had a flair for the dramatic, that I'd shown up broke and asking for help more times than he could count, that this was just my latest performance. None of that was true. I hadn't asked him for money since I was 23, but I didn't correct him. Arguing with my father in front of an audience had never once worked in my favor. He'd had 30 years of practice turning any conversation into a referendum on my character, and I'd learned the only way to win was not to play. So I picked up my own plate and walked it to the far end of the table, sitting down in an open seat instead of standing there any longer. I ate my dinner in a chair that hadn't been assigned to me, at a table where my name card sat abandoned 20 feet away next to an empty chair that had been shoved a foot out of place. Nobody moved it back. It stayed there for the rest of the night, a small, silent monument to what had just happened. What none of them knew, my father least of all, was that I had spent the last 3 weeks doing something that would make this dinner the last time he would ever get to speak to me like that from a position of actual power. My sister was still occasionally lifting her phone to capture some other moment of the evening, with no idea either. He just didn't know it yet. Neither did I, fully, in the sense that I hadn't expected this particular provocation on this particular night. But some part of me had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment for weeks, and I knew that whatever he said to me tonight would be one of the last times it would actually cost me anything. To understand why my father could say something like that to me at a birthday party in front of 30 people, without a flicker of hesitation, you have to understand what my father actually is. Underneath the version of himself he performs at family gatherings. He runs a restaurant, not owns, though he's said my restaurant so many times over the years that most people genuinely believe the deed has his name on it. It's a place called the Copper Kettle, a mid-sized dining room with a reputation for good steaks, on a corner lot that's been valuable real estate since the neighborhood started gentrifying. My father has managed it day to day for over 2 decades. He hires the staff, negotiates with vendors, stands at the host stand on Friday nights, and greets regulars by name. People love him for it, because in that context, he is genuinely good at his job. What he is not good at is being a father to a daughter he decided, somewhere in my early childhood, was less valuable than the people he could impress. My parents divorced when I was 6. My mother got primary custody, so I grew up in a small apartment across town from the restaurant, from the big house, from the version of my father that showed up at holidays talking about expansion plans. My sister, 3 years younger, stayed with him and his second wife, in the house with the pool. She didn't choose that arrangement any more than I chose mine, but growing up on opposite sides of that divide meant we grew up as essentially different species of daughter to the same man. My sister got piano lessons and a brand new car on her 16th birthday, because my father liked to be seen giving gifts like that. I got child support checks that arrived late more often than not, and a father who took me to dinner twice a year and spent most of it on his phone. The poor, useless kid comment wasn't new. It was an escalation of a joke he'd been making since I was a teenager, one that had calcified over the years into something closer to an actual belief he held about me. He genuinely thought that because I hadn't married into money, hadn't started a business he could brag about, I had failed at the only things that that mattered. What he didn't know, because I'd stopped telling him anything about my actual life around 25, was that I'd spent the last 8 years building a career in commercial finance, the unglamorous kind that comes with a very specific, very useful set of skills. I understood trusts. I understood lease structures and the difference between owning an asset and merely operating it in a way that almost nobody else at that table did. My grandmother knew. She was the one person in the family who had always asked real questions when I called, who had, in fact, been the one to first explain to me, years earlier, the actual structure of how the copper kettle had come to exist. She'd built it, not my father, her. In 1974, when my grandmother was 32 and recently widowed, she'd taken the small life insurance payout from my grandfather's death and used it as a down payment on a corner lot nobody else wanted because the building on it was falling apart. She'd renovated it herself, mostly, and run it as a small diner for the first decade, breakfast and lunch only, building up enough capital to expand it into a full dinner restaurant by the time my father was old enough to work there. He'd started as a busser, then a line cook, then, in his late 20s, when my grandmother's eyesight was starting to go, he'd become the manager, and eventually simply started calling it his. The land was still hers. The building was still hers. The lease that governed the arrangement had been drawn up decades earlier and named my grandmother, alone, as the owner of record. My father had built exactly none of it. He'd run it well for years, and I want to be fair about that. But running something and owning something are different facts, and my father had spent 2 decades letting everyone, including himself, forget the difference. The call came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the birthday dinner. While I was still at my desk finishing up a client file, I almost let it go to voicemail, but I saw my grandmother's name on the screen and picked up, because I always picked up for her. "I need you to come by this weekend," she said, without much preamble. "Not for a visit. I need your help with something, and I don't want to explain it over the phone." I asked if everything was okay. She said, in the dry tone she uses when she's decided something and doesn't want to be talked out of it, that she was simply tired of a situation that had gone on far too long, and that she trusted me to help her fix it quietly. I drove to her house that Saturday. She made coffee in the percolator she's had since before I was born, and we sat at her kitchen table. She didn't waste time getting to the point. "I'm going to restructure the trust," she said. "The land, the lease, the accounts, all of it. I want to take your father's name off of everything and name you as trustee instead." I sat very still for a moment, trying to process what she'd just said. My first instinct was to ask if she'd talked to my father about this, or to my sister, because that seemed like the responsible question, the one that would preserve some version of family harmony. "I haven't talked to either of them," she said, before I could ask, "and I'm not going to, not until it's done. Your father has spent 20 years telling everyone he built that restaurant from nothing. Your sister asked me outright at Christmas 2 years ago when I was planning on updating the will, as if I were already halfway in the ground. I'm 80, not dead, and I am done pretending I don't notice things. I asked her why me, specifically, and not some outside trustee, some neutral party who wouldn't have to sit across a family dinner table from the people whose lives this would upend." She looked at me for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice softened in a way I don't often hear from her. "Because you're the only one who's never asked me for anything," she said. "You call because you want to know how I'm doing, not because you're checking on your inheritance. You remembered your grandfather's birthday last month without me reminding you, and he's been gone 31 years. I trust you because you've never once given me a reason not to." I asked the practical question, the one my job had trained me to ask before any emotional consideration. Did she understand what this would actually do to my father's day-to-day life? Restructuring a trust of this size meant he'd suddenly answer to someone else for every lease decision, every major expense, every hire and fire. She said she understood completely and had already thought through the alternative, which was doing nothing, watching him treat something she'd built with her own hands as though it belonged to him by birthright until the whole mess became a probate fight after she died. "I'd rather deal with this now, while I'm alive to see it done right," she said, "than leave you all to fight over it after I'm gone." I agreed to help her, though I asked her to sleep on it for another week first. By the end of that Saturday, I'd agreed to find her an attorney with no ties to my father's circle, someone who could move quickly and quietly. I found one within a few days, a woman named Ms. Alvarez who specialized in family trust restructuring and had, refreshingly, no interest in the family drama beyond what was legally relevant. My grandmother met with her twice that first week, both times during the day, while my father was handling lunch service. I didn't tell anyone, not my closest friends, not my father, not my sister. I told myself this wasn't secrecy for its own sake, but a practical calculation. If my father found out before the paperwork was finalized, he'd find a way to talk her out of it. He always had for 30 years, with a phone call here, a surprise visit there, a carefully timed reminder of how much the restaurant meant to him. I wasn't willing to let him talk her out of doing something that was, by every legal and moral measure I could see, entirely hers to do. The next 3 weeks were, in retrospect, the strangest stretch of my adult life. I was moving through my normal routine, going to work, having dinner with my grandmother every few days like nothing unusual was happening, while quietly carrying information I knew would eventually detonate through the center of my family. Ms. Alvarez worked fast, but a restructuring of this scale still took real time. There were title searches to confirm the land was clean of any claims my father might have filed over the years, which it was. There were operating accounts to untangle, angle, since he'd added himself as a secondary signer on several of them years back without my grandmother's explicit sign-off, a detail that turned out to be legally reversible, since the accounts had always been held in the trust's name, not his, personally. I met with my grandmother and the attorney 4 times over those 3 weeks, always on days when I knew he'd be tied up running lunch and dinner service. There were 2 close calls. The first happened when I was leaving my grandmother's house after a meeting and nearly ran into my father's car pulling into the driveway. He'd stopped by unannounced, something he did periodically, usually when he wanted something from her, though he always framed it as checking in on his mother. I ducked my head as we passed, and apparently the tinted windows were enough, because he never mentioned seeing me there. I called my grandmother that night, worried, and asked what he'd wanted. She said a friend of his had mentioned seeing a woman who looked like an attorney leaving her neighborhood, and he'd asked her about it casually. She'd told him the woman was helping a neighbor with an estate matter. He'd accepted this without pushing further, because it hadn't occurred to him, even for a moment, that his own mother might be doing something behind his back. The second close call happened with my sister, and it worried me more. I ran into her at a coffee shop near my grandmother's house, purely by coincidence. She didn't ask why I was in the neighborhood. She was distracted, talking about a promotion she was hoping for, about how she thought Dad was finally going to give her more responsibility at the restaurant since she'd been helping with the social media accounts and sitting in on a few vendor meetings. I felt a strange, complicated pang of guilt during that conversation, not because I doubted what I was doing, but because I could see she genuinely believed she was earning something real. She wasn't lying to herself. She actually thought a few meetings constituted meaningful groundwork toward running the place. Our father had let her believe that, the same way he'd let both of us believe things about our places in the family that weren't true. I didn't say anything to correct her. I finished my coffee and went home. By the end of the 3rd week, the paperwork was complete. Ms. Alvarez walked my grandmother through every page one final time and had her sign in front of a notary. The land title, the lease, the operating accounts, all of it was formally reassigned into a restructured trust naming her as settlor, with me as trustee, effective immediately. It was done. My father's name had been quietly, legally, entirely removed from everything tied to a restaurant he'd spent 2 decades calling his own, and he had absolutely no idea it had happened. The plan, initially, had been to tell him gently. My grandmother wanted to sit him down privately the following week, explain her reasoning, give him time to adjust. That was the plan going into her 80th birthday party, 3 days after the paperwork was finalized. The plan changed the moment he pushed my chair away from the table and told 30 relatives that he didn't sit with poor, useless children. I sat with the choir friend through the appetizer course that followed, making pleasant small talk about her grandchildren, while the conversation at the main cluster of the table drifted back to normal. That's the strange mechanics of a family gathering. The way a genuinely cruel moment can simply be absorbed back into the general noise of a party, wine glasses refilled, side conversations resuming, as though nothing happened, while the person it happened to sits there processing it in real time, alone, in a room full of people. My grandmother, seated where she always sat, hadn't said anything during the moment itself. I watched her from down the table, and her face had gone very still, very controlled, in a way I recognized because it was the same expression she wore whenever she was deciding not to react to something yet. She caught my eye once, briefly, and gave me the smallest possible nod, something that could have meant anything to an outside observer, but that I understood completely. Not yet, not here, not like this, not as a scene, but soon. Dinner continued for the better part of 2 hours after that. The main course came out, a spread of roasted chicken and vegetables that had been simmering in the kitchen since early that morning. There was a round of toasts, mostly generic, mostly about my grandmother's longevity and her cooking, and how much the family owed her. Toasts that felt slightly hollow to me now, knowing what I knew about how little most of the people offering them actually understood about what she'd built, or what she was owed. My father gave one of the toasts. It was warm, funny in places, the kind of performance he was genuinely good at, telling a story about learning to make her famous pot roast as a teenager, about how she'd taught him everything he knew about running a kitchen. People laughed at the right places. My sister recorded that one too, though this time it was clearly meant for a nicer purpose, something she'd probably post later with a caption about family and legacy. I watched him give that toast and felt something harden in me that hadn't fully been there before. It wasn't new information exactly. I'd known for years that my father was capable of genuine warmth toward people he'd decided were worth it, that the coldness he directed at me wasn't a character flaw that touched everyone equally, but a specific targeted choice about who deserved his effort. Watching him charm an entire room 2 hours after telling that same room I was poor and useless just confirmed one more time that the coldness was a decision, not a limitation. It was near the end of the meal, as the cake was being brought out, that my father stood up again and tapped his wine glass with a fork, the universal signal for an announcement. "I have some news I wanted to share while we're all together," he said, and I felt something in my stomach tighten slightly, some instinct that whatever came next was going to matter. He talked for a minute about the restaurant's recent success, about a piece in the local paper that had named the Copper Kettle one of the best steakhouses in the metro area, about plans to possibly expand the private dining room in the next year. Then he said the part that mattered. "Given everything happening with the business right now, I've decided it's time to formally bring the next generation generation into leadership. Effective the first of the year, I'm transferring management authority to my daughter. He said it with a kind of ceremonial weight, like he was bestowing something significant, and in the world he believed he lived in, he was. My sister's face lit up immediately, genuine surprise mixed with genuine excitement, and I understood, watching her, that this hadn't been something he'd told her in advance. He was staging this, the same way he'd staged the humiliation earlier that evening. Both moments designed for an audience, both moments about performing his own power rather than actually communicating with the people involved. You've been putting in the work, he told her in front of everyone, and it's time you got the recognition for it. My sister stood up, hugged him, and there was a round of applause from the table, genuine and warm, aunts and uncles congratulating her, my cousin saying something about how they'd have to come by for the family discount now. I clapped too, because not clapping would have made me the story again, and I had no interest in being the story twice in one night. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't simple. Part of me almost laughed out loud because I knew something none of them knew, which was that my father was, at that exact moment, standing at the head of a table announcing a transfer of authority over assets he no longer legally controlled. He was rearranging furniture in a house that had already, 3 days earlier, quietly stopped belonging to him. Every word of that announcement, every proud sentence about bringing the next generation into leadership, was a sentence about power he no longer had. But another part of me, a smaller and more complicated part, felt something closer to sadness on my sister's behalf. She didn't know that either. She was standing there believing she'd just been handed something real, something earned, and within a matter of hours, that belief was going to collapse in front of the same room of people currently applauding her. I didn't warn her. I told myself, sitting there, that this wasn't cruelty, that I hadn't engineered the timing of any of this, that my grandmother's decision had been made and finalized 3 days before my father decided to stage this announcement, and that the collision between the two things was his doing, not mine. All of that was true, but I also knew with total clarity exactly what was coming, and I let her enjoy the applause anyway, because there was no version of the evening where I could have stopped what was about to happen, and telling her early would have only meant telling my father early too. The cake was cut, the candles were blown out. My grandmother made a wish that she didn't share with anyone, smiling in a way that, looking back, I understand now was not the smile of a woman celebrating her birthday, but the smile of a woman who knew exactly what the next hour of her family's life was about to look like. The next 20 minutes unfolded the way I imagined they would have if I hadn't known anything at all about what was coming, which was, in its own way, the strangest part of the whole night. I watched a completely ordinary family celebration happen around me, layered directly on top of a situation that was about to detonate it, and the two things existed simultaneously without touching, like transparencies laid over each other. One image of a happy family and one image of a family about to fracture, occupying the exact same physical space. My sister moved around the table accepting congratulations, practically glowing. My aunt hugged her so hard she nearly knocked over the cake stand, and my sister laughed, steadying it with one hand while still holding her champagne glass in the other. My uncle started asking her practical questions about the new role, whether she'd be handling payroll now too, whether my father was planning to stay on in some kind of advisory capacity, and my sister answered each question with the easy confidence of someone who had clearly been thinking about this moment, or some version of it, for a long time, even if the specifics had caught her off guard. My father refilled his wine glass and settled back into his seat, the one closest to where the toasts had all been given from that night, looking, for all the world, like a man who had just closed a significant business deal rather than a man who had just handed his daughter a title with no legal substance behind it. He was telling my cousin a story about the restaurant's early days, one I'd heard variations of many times before, the version where he'd single-handedly transformed a struggling neighborhood diner into a destination restaurant through sheer force of will and hospitality instinct. In this version of the story, my grandmother appeared mostly as a background figure, someone who'd owned the original building and occasionally signed a check, a supporting character in what he clearly experienced as his own origin story. Nobody at that table, listening to him tell it, understood that the checks weren't the point. The lease was the point. The land underneath the entire building was the point, and neither of those things had ever belonged to him at all, not for one single day of the 20 years he'd spent building an identity around them. I sat there for a few more minutes, finishing a slice of cake I didn't particularly taste, watching my father perform ownership over something he'd already lost, watching my sister accept authority over something that no longer existed in the form she thought it did, and I felt the particular strange calm that comes right before something you've been anticipating for weeks finally happens. Not nervousness exactly, more like the feeling of standing at the top of a hill you've climbed slowly, deliberately, and knowing that the next part is simply going to happen to gravity now, without much more effort required from you. I excused myself from the table, telling the choir friend I needed to use the restroom, and instead walked toward the kitchen, where I knew I'd have a few minutes of privacy. I pulled out my phone and opened my messages with Ms. Alvarez, who I knew was on standby that evening, because my grandmother had asked her to be, in case things needed to move faster than the original gentle conversation plan had anticipated. I typed 2 words, "Tonight works." I sent it, and stood there in the kitchen doorway for a moment, watching the housekeeper clear clear plates, listening to the muffled sound of the party continuing in the next room, my father's voice rising occasionally in laughter, my sister's voice threading through with questions and excited responses to congratulations. I thought, briefly, about what I was actually about to do, about the fact that once this happened, there would be no version of this family that looked the way it had looked an hour earlier. I thought about whether I had any doubt about doing it. I didn't. Not about the substance of it anyway. My grandmother had made her decision independently, for reasons that were entirely her own to have, about assets that had always, legally and morally, belonged to her. I wasn't taking anything from anyone that had ever actually been theirs to lose. I was simply the mechanism by which the truth of who owned what was finally going to become visible to everyone in that room, including the two people who had spent the entire evening performing power and generosity over things that were never theirs to distribute. The only real question I sat with, standing in that kitchen doorway, was timing, and even that question had mostly already been answered for me. My father had made the decision to humiliate me in front of 30 relatives before dinner even started. He'd made the decision to stage a false handoff of authority to my sister in front of that same audience less than an hour ago. Every choice that had led to this exact moment, this exact night, had been his, not mine. I hadn't engineered a trap. I'd simply stopped protecting him from a truth he'd been avoiding for 20 years on a night he'd chosen, through his own actions, to make impossible to postpone any longer. I walked back into the dining room and returned to my seat next to the choir friend and waited. 20 minutes passed. The party had settled into its late evening rhythm, some relatives starting to gather their things, others lingering over coffee, my father moving between conversations with the easy social grace that made him genuinely good at hosting, even when the event wasn't technically his to host. I sat near the window with a cup of coffee I wasn't really drinking, watching the driveway because I knew approximately when Ms. Alvarez would arrive, and I wanted to see the headlights before anyone else did. They swept across the driveway a little after 9, cutting briefly through the front windows before the car came to a stop. Nobody else at the table seemed to notice. I'd been waiting specifically for this, so I was the only one whose attention shifted immediately toward the front door. Ms. Alvarez let herself in through the front entrance, which she was able to do because my grandmother had given her a key earlier that week, anticipating exactly this scenario. She was dressed simply, professionally, carrying a single leather folder under one arm, and she walked into the dining room with the calm, unhurried confidence of someone who does this kind of thing regularly and has learned not to perform urgency even when the moment itself is significant. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," she said, her tone pleasant enough that for a moment, several relatives near the door assumed she was simply a friend of the family arriving late to the party. "I was hoping I could have a few minutes with everyone. My name is Ms. Alvarez. I'm an attorney representing your grandmother's interests." My father set down his coffee cup and looked at her with the mild, slightly amused confusion of a man who assumed this was some kind of minor administrative matter that could be handled quickly and painlessly. "Of course," he said. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," she said. "I have some documents I need to walk through with the family, specifically regarding the trust that governs the Copper Kettle's underlying assets." I watched my father's expression shift slightly, curiosity edging in, though still nothing close to alarm. He glanced at me once, briefly, and I understood in that glance that some part of him had, for just a fraction of a second, wondered whether I had something to do with this, before dismissing the thought entirely, because it genuinely had never occurred to him, not once in his entire life, that I might be capable of orchestrating something at this scale. Ms. Alvarez set the folder down on the table, in the space that had been cleared for dessert plates, and opened it. "As of 3 days ago, your grandmother formally restructured the family trust that holds the land, the lease, and the operating accounts associated with the restaurant," she said. "I'm here tonight, at her request, to walk everyone through the changes." My father reached for the folder, the motion automatic, the reach of a man who has spent 20 years assuming that any document concerning the restaurant is, by default, his to review and sign. His hand actually touched the pen clipped to the inside of the folder before Ms. Alvarez gently moved it slightly out of reach, not rudely, but with the clear, practiced firmness of someone who has done this before. "There's nothing here that requires your signature," she said. "The restructuring is already complete. I'm simply here to inform the family of the changes and answer any questions." The room, which had still been carrying the low murmur of a dozen side conversations, went quiet in a way I hadn't heard all night, quieter even than the silence that had followed my father's comment at the start of the dinner. That earlier silence had been the silence of shock at cruelty. This silence was the silence of a room slowly realizing that the ground underneath a specific person's entire identity had just shifted, and nobody yet understood exactly how far. My father opened the folder himself, ignoring the offer to have Ms. Alvarez walk him through it verbally, and began reading. I watched his face while he did, and I want to describe it as precisely as I can, because I had spent 20 years watching that face perform confidence, warmth, charm, and occasionally cold dismissal, and I had never once seen it do what it did in that moment. It didn't collapse dramatically. There was no gasp, no dropped folder, nothing cinematic. What happened instead was slower and, I think, more genuinely devastating to watch. His expression simply emptied, piece by piece, as he moved from page to page, the practiced social mask sliding away to reveal something underneath that I had genuinely never seen on him before, something uncertain. His name wasn't on the land title anymore. It wasn't on the lease. It wasn't listed as a signer on any of the operating accounts. Every asset connected to the restaurant he had spent 20 years telling everyone, including himself, that he had built from nothing, had been formally reassigned into a trust that named my grandmother as settler and named me, his older daughter, the one he had pushed away from the dinner table 3 hours earlier, as trustee. "This isn't real," he said, and his voice had lost the confident, performative warmth it had carried all evening. "This has to be some kind of mistake." My sister grabbed the folder from him, scanning the pages herself, her earlier glow completely gone, replaced by something closer to panic. "This can't be right," she said. "He just told everyone I'm running the restaurant now. What does this even mean for that?" "It means," Ms. Alvarez said, gently but without softening the actual content of what she was saying, "that the authority to make that kind of decision was never his to give. Your grandmother restructured this trust independently, with full legal counsel 3 days ago. Any announcements about management authority made this evening would need to be reviewed and approved by the current trustee going forward." Every eye at the table turned toward me. I didn't stand up right away. I let the silence hold for a moment, because there was nothing I needed to say yet that the folder hadn't already said on its own. My father looked at me across the table, and for the first time all night, maybe for the first time in years, he actually looked at me, not through me, but directly at me, with an expression I could only describe as searching, like he was trying to find the daughter he thought he understood inside someone who had apparently been capable of this the entire time. "What did you do?" he said. It wasn't really a question. It came out flat, almost hollow. "I didn't do anything," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I'd kept it 3 hours earlier, when he'd pushed my chair away from the same table. "Grandma made her decision. I just stopped protecting you from the truth about what you don't actually own." He stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor and tipped backward, hitting the ground with a sharp crack. It was the same chair he'd pulled away from me 3 hours earlier without ever pushing it back. It had just sat there, a foot out of place, the whole night, and now it lay on its side on the hardwood floor. My sister was still holding the folder, flipping through the pages as though a second reading might reveal a different outcome. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice cracking. "You knew about this the whole time he was up there announcing it, and you let him do it anyway." I didn't have a clean answer, because she wasn't entirely wrong. I had known, and I hadn't warned her. "I didn't build tonight to hurt you specifically," I told her. "Grandma finalized this 3 days ago, before either of you knew anything was happening. Dad chose to make his announcement tonight, without asking her first, the same way he's made most of his decisions about that restaurant for 20 years. I didn't create the collision, I just didn't stop it." She pushed the folder away from her, harder than necessary, and sat back, staring at nothing. My father, still standing, looked at Ms. Alvarez, then at me, then back at the folder. "You can't do this," he said, though the sentence came out with less conviction than the words themselves suggested. 20 years. I built that restaurant's reputation. That has to count for something. "It counts for a great deal as an employee," I said. "You're welcome to keep working there, under the same terms as any other manager. But you don't get to keep telling people you own something you've never legally held, and you don't get to keep deciding unilaterally who inherits authority over it." He didn't say anything else for a long moment. The room stayed quiet, 30 relatives watching a scene none of them had expected. It was my grandmother who finally spoke, from where she'd been sitting quietly through the entire exchange, watching her son's face do things she had apparently been waiting 20 years to see it do. "I've watched you take credit for my work for 2 decades, she said. Her voice was steady, carrying easily across the now silent room. "I watched you tell every guest at that restaurant a story where I barely exist, when the truth is, I built it out of a widow's insurance check and 12 years of breakfast shifts before you ever set foot behind that counter. I let you have the credit for a long time because I loved you and told myself it didn't cost me anything." She paused, and in that pause, I watched my father's face crumple, just slightly, at the corners, the first genuine crack in 20 years of performed confidence. "It cost me tonight," she said, "watching you push your own daughter's chair away from my table on my birthday and tell a room full of people she was useless. I'm done." Nobody clapped this time. My father stood there, chair still lying on its side behind him, folder open on the table in front of him, and said nothing at all, because there was genuinely nothing left for him to say that would change what everyone in that room now understood to be true. I walked back to my own seat, the one with my name card still sitting untouched exactly where it had been placed hours earlier, and sat down. "You can stay for cake," I told him, "but you don't get to sit at the head of a table you no longer own."